The bedroom door at Balmoral Castle opened at 20:34 a.m. on August 12, 1989, and Queen Elizabeth stood frozen in the doorway for exactly 7 seconds. She counted them later obsessively, trying to understand why she hadn't screamed or moved or done anything except stare, watching her husband of 40, 2 years lying in bed with a woman who was not her, their bodies intertwined in a way that left absolutely no room for innocent explanation, and the woman's face turned toward the door, showing not shame or fear, but a smile, a deliberate, satisfied smile that told Elizabeth this wasn't an accident or a mistake, but a calculated act of defiance, a message delivered through the most intimate betrayal possible. The woman was young, maybe 30, maybe younger, with blonde hair spread across Philip's pillow and a body that Elizabeth's 73-year-old form could never compete with, and Philip himself was still asleep or pretending to be, his arm draped possessively across the woman's waist in a gesture of casual intimacy that felt more violating than the sex itself because it suggested comfort, familiarity, a relationship rather than just a one-night indiscretion. And Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth II, monarch of the United Kingdom, woman who'd endured 42 years of rumors and whispers and barely concealed infidelities, finally had proof. Undeniable visual confirmation that her husband had never been faithful, had never belonged to her, had spent their entire marriage treating their vows as suggestions rather than commitments. But here's what would destroy her over the coming months and years. It wasn't the affair that broke her, wasn't even the betrayal or the humiliation or the casual cruelty of doing this in their own home. It was what happened next, what she did, what she chose. Because Elizabeth didn't scream or confront or demand explanations. She quietly closed the door, walked back to her own bedroom, climbed into her own bed, and never, ever mentioned it. Not to Philip, not to anyone. She absorbed the betrayal, swallowed it whole, buried it so deep that even she could pretend it hadn't happened. And that choice, to protect the institution over her own dignity, to choose appearances over truth, to perform perfect marriage while knowing it was a complete lie, would rot her from the inside out for the rest of her life. What kind of woman witnesses her husband's infidelity and says nothing? What kind of queen values the monarchy's image more than her own humanity? And what does it cost a person to carry that kind of secret, that level of humiliation, for decades without ever acknowledging the wound? I can say one LK30 sayin', the sound Elizabeth remembered most clearly wasn't the gasp she'd suppressed or the click of the door closing or even the faint rustle of sheets as the woman had adjusted position. It was her own heartbeat, thundering so loud in her ears that she'd been certain it would wake them, would alert them to her presence, would force a confrontation she desperately didn't want. Because even in that moment of discovery, even with visual proof of Philip's infidelity burning itself into her retinas, her first instinct wasn't rage or heartbreak. It was calculation, damage control. How to handle this without creating scandal, without giving the press ammunition, without destroying the carefully maintained fiction that the royal marriage was stable and successful. 42 years of training kicked in, automatically assess the threat, determine the least damaging response, prioritize institutional preservation over personal feelings. The protocol was so deeply ingrained that it functioned even when her world was exploding, even when every human instinct screamed for confrontation and catharsis and acknowledgement of betrayal. She was a queen before she was a wife, before she was a woman, before she was a person, and that hierarchy, crown, institution, appearance, then maybe, possibly, if there was anything left, self, had been so thoroughly programmed into her that she couldn't access rage, even when rage was the only appropriate response. What does it do to a person to be that controlled, that suppressed, that completely divorced from authentic emotional reaction? Elizabeth would spend the rest of her life wondering if she was even human anymore, or if the crown had successfully transformed her into something else entirely, a very sophisticated robot, a performance with no performer, a role that had consumed the person who'd started playing it until nothing authentic remained, just reflexive institutional protection, just automatic damage control, just the endless, suffocating weight of appearance over truth. She'd arrived at Balmoral 3 days earlier for the annual summer retreat, looking forward to the relative privacy an informality the Scottish estate afforded. Philip had arrived separately. He'd been in London for some naval function, some reunion with old military colleagues. Some excuse that Elizabeth hadn't questioned because she'd long ago learned not to question Philip's activities too closely. Learned that knowing created obligations. That proof demanded response. That as long as she could maintain plausible deniability, she could continue performing the role of happily married queen, without the complications that actual knowledge would introduce. It was a coward's bargain, she knew that. A deliberate choice to remain ignorant rather than confront truths that would require difficult decisions. But it had worked for 4 decades, had allowed her to maintain the appearance of stable marriage, of partnership, of the fairy tale the public wanted to believe. And appearances mattered. Appearances were everything. The monarchy existed because people believed in it, and people believed in it because it performed stability and tradition and continuity. A royal divorce, or even public acknowledgement of infidelity, would damage that belief, would crack the illusion, would reveal that the perfect family at the center of the institution was just as flawed and dysfunctional as everyone else's family. So Elizabeth had made a deal with herself years ago. Don't look too closely. Don't demand fidelity you know doesn't exist. Don't force confrontations that can only end badly. Just maintain the performance. Just protect the institution. Just survive. It had seemed manageable, sustainable, the price of duty. But that was before she'd opened a bedroom door and seen proof so undeniable that even her practiced self-deception couldn't explain it away. The woman in Philip's bed wasn't anyone Elizabeth recognized. Not a member of staff, not a social acquaintance, not anyone from their usual circles. Which meant Philip had brought her to Balmoral deliberately, had installed her somewhere in the castle, had arranged this encounter with enough confidence that he'd felt comfortable sleeping with her in the family home. The audacity of it was breathtaking. The disrespect so profound it actually circled back to being almost impressive, because this wasn't a drunken mistake or a moment of weakness or even a serious affair conducted with some attempt at discretion. This was a fuck you. This was Philip asserting ownership of his life, his choices, his body in the one place Elizabeth considered sacrosanct. They'd had an understanding for years. Philip could have his friendships, as long as he was discreet, as long as it didn't create scandal, as long as Elizabeth could maintain plausible deniability. But bringing another woman to Balmoral, to the family retreat, to a bedroom down the hall from Elizabeth's own room, that violated every unspoken rule they'd established. That was deliberate provocation. That was Philip saying, I don't care about your feelings or your dignity or your position. I'll do what I want, where I want, with whom I want, and you'll accept it because confronting me would cost you more than it would cost me. And the truly devastating part, he was right. Confrontation would create scandal, would force choices, would require Elizabeth to either accept public humiliation or pursue separation divorce, both of which would damage the monarchy far more than Philip's reputation. He'd calculated the power dynamics perfectly, had understood that Elizabeth's devotion to duty meant she'd absorb infinite humiliation rather than risk institutional damage. He'd weaponized her sense of responsibility against her. And Elizabeth, standing in that hallway at 2:34 a.m. with her heart shattering and her hands shaking, understood with perfect clarity that she was trapped. Completely, absolutely, by vows and duty and the weight of a crown that demanded she sacrifice everything, including dignity, to maintain appearances. What do you do when you realize your entire marriage has been a lie? And you can't even acknowledge that realization, because doing so would threaten something you value more than your own happiness. Elizabeth had walked back to her bedroom like a ghost, her body moving automatically while her mind remained frozen in that doorway, replaying the image over and over, Philip's arm around the woman's waist, the intimate comfort of their positioning, the woman's satisfied smile. That smile haunted her most, because it suggested the woman knew Elizabeth might find them, had possibly even hoped for it, wanted to send a message that she'd won some competition Elizabeth hadn't even known they were having. Won Philip's attention, his desire, his preference, made the Queen of England into a rejected, humiliated wife who couldn't even command her own husband's fidelity. The power dynamics were intentionally inverted. This nameless woman in Philip's bed had more claim on him than his wife of 42 years. Had more of his genuine attention and affection than Elizabeth had received in decades. Was getting the parts of Philip, the passion, the tenderness, the actual presence, that Elizabeth had never successfully accessed, even in the beginning of their marriage, when things were supposedly good. The affair itself was one thing. Affairs happened, even in royal marriages. But this felt different. This felt like replacement, like Philip creating a whole separate intimate life that Elizabeth was excluded from, and then rubbing her face in that exclusion by conducting it in her own home. This wasn't about sex. This was about power. About Philip asserting that he'd never actually belonged to Elizabeth, had never been truly hers, had been performing obligation while reserving his authentic self for others. And Elizabeth, climbing into her own bed alone, while her husband slept with another woman down the hall, had to confront a question she'd been avoiding for 4 decades. Had Philip ever loved her, even a little, even in the beginning? Or had their entire marriage been transactional from the start? A Greek prince with no money marrying into the British royal family for status and security, performing devotion while feeling none of it, enduring Elizabeth as the price of his position. Harry Hoke won the 25%. The worst part came the next morning. Elizabeth had barely slept, had lain in bed replaying the scene until her eyes burned and her chest ached, and she felt like she might actually be sick from the accumulated weight of humiliation and grief. She'd finally dozed off around 5, and when she woke at 8, she'd briefly forgotten. Had those few blessed seconds of remembering before reality crashed back, and she had to relive the discovery all over again. She'd gotten dressed mechanically, armor of clothing and jewelry and perfect hair, helping her reconstruct the queen persona, even while Elizabeth the person felt shattered beyond repair. She'd gone down to breakfast expecting, dreading, some kind of confrontation or acknowledgement. Philip would be apologetic or defensive or something that indicated he knew she'd seen him. But when she entered the breakfast room, Philip was already there, reading his newspaper, drinking his coffee, looking completely normal and at ease. And when he saw her, he said, "Morning, darling. Sleep well," as if nothing had happened, as if he had no idea she'd witnessed his betrayal, as if this was just another ordinary morning in their ordinary marriage. Elizabeth had frozen, breakfast plate in hand, trying to determine if he was truly unaware, or if this was another level of cruelty, pretending innocence, forcing her to either call out the lie or become complicit in it by playing along. His expression showed nothing but casual friendliness, no guilt, no nervousness, no indication whatsoever that anything unusual had occurred, which meant either A, he genuinely didn't know she'd opened that door, hadn't heard her, had remained asleep through the whole thing, or B, he knew perfectly well and was calling her bluff, confident that she wouldn't make a scene, wouldn't risk the confrontation, wouldn't choose truth over appearances. Elizabeth had stood there for a long moment, the weight of decision crushing her, before quietly saying, "Fine, thank you," and sitting down, accepting her role in the charade, choosing to pretend, becoming complicit in her own humiliation by refusing to acknowledge it. And Philip had smiled, said, "Slept like the dead. Best night's sleep I've had in months," and returned to his newspaper. The casual cruelty of that statement, slept like the dead, in bed with another woman, should have broken her remaining composure, should have forced a confrontation. But Elizabeth had just buttered her toast and drunk her tea and performed normalcy while dying inside, becoming the thing she'd been trained to be, a perfect queen who maintained appearances regardless of personal cost. What kind of relationship can survive that level of dishonesty? What kind of marriage continues when both parties know it's a complete lie, but agree to never acknowledge that knowledge? The woman never appeared. Elizabeth looked for her over the following days, scanned faces of staff guests, anyone who might be the blonde from Philip's bed. But either she'd left immediately, or she was being kept hidden, or Elizabeth was looking at her and simply didn't recognize her with clothes on, and without Philip's arm draped across her body. The not knowing was its own torture. Was she still here? Still sleeping with Philip? Was Elizabeth passing her in corridors, making polite conversation, while both of them knew about the affair but pretended they didn't. The paranoia was consuming, made worse by Philip's continued casual affection. A hand on Elizabeth's shoulder at dinner, a kiss on her cheek in the morning, the performance of devoted husband that he'd perfected over 4 decades. Every gesture of false intimacy felt like another betrayal. Every darling and dear, a reminder that words meant nothing, that Philip could perform affection while feeling none of it, that Elizabeth had spent 42 years accepting the performance as if it were real. She studied him across the dinner table. This man she'd married when she was 21. This man who'd been by her side through coronation and scandal and endless years of public service. Did she even know him? Had she ever? Or had she been in love with an illusion, a performance as carefully constructed as her own? He caught her staring once, raised an eyebrow quizzically, asked if something was wrong. And Elizabeth had smiled, said no, nothing was wrong, everything was fine. The lie came automatically, protecting him, protecting the marriage, protecting the institution, protecting everything except herself. She'd tried to remember their early years, searching for evidence that Philip had genuinely loved her, once even if that love had faded. Their courtship had been brief but intense. He'd been so handsome in his naval uniform, so confident and charming and different from the stiff courtiers she'd grown up around. She'd fallen hard and fast, teenage infatuation transforming into love that had felt real and consuming. But had he felt the same? Or had he just been an ambitious young man who saw opportunity in a princess who would be queen? She remembered their wedding night, awkward and disappointing in the way first times often are. But she'd assumed it would get better, that passion would develop with time and familiarity. But it never really had. Their physical relationship had been dutiful rather than passionate, sufficient to produce 4 children, but never approaching the intimacy Elizabeth had hoped for. She'd told herself that was normal, that royal marriages were about partnership and duty rather than romance, that expecting passion was naive and unrealistic. But watching Philip sleep with another woman had destroyed that comfortable rationalization, because he clearly was capable of passion, just not with her, never with her. She wasn't desirable or interesting or compelling enough to inspire the kind of desire he showed others. She was the obligation, the duty, the role he performed while reserving his authentic desires for women who weren't queen, who weren't constrained by protocol and position, who could offer him something Elizabeth apparently couldn't. What was she lacking? What deficiency in her had driven him into so many other beds over so many years? Was it her devotion to duty, her emotional reserve, her inability to be spontaneous or playful, or anything other than perfectly controlled? Had she driven him away by being too much queen and not enough woman? Or was this always who Philip was? A man incapable of fidelity regardless of who he'd married. And she'd just been naive enough to believe she could be different, could be enough, could earn exclusive devotion through perfect wifely performance. Her REOK 40% 3 days after the discovery, Elizabeth did something she'd never done before. She went through Philip's belongings, waited until he was out shooting, told staff she needed privacy in his rooms, and systematically searched for evidence. Letters, photographs, anything that might explain who the woman was, or how long this had been going on, or how many others there had been. It was degrading, this descent into suspicious, wife cliché, but she needed to know, needed to understand the scope of her humiliation. She found a locked drawer in his desk, picked the lock with a letter opener. Surprisingly easy, the mechanism old and simple, and inside were photographs, dozens of them. Different women, different locations, different years, a visual history of Philip's infidelities spanning their entire marriage. Some of the photos were innocent. Philip with female friends at social events, nothing overtly inappropriate. But others were intimate, clearly romantic. Philip's arm around waists, kisses on cheeks, body language that screamed relationship rather than friendship. And the dates on the photos, some from the 1950s, early in their marriage, when Elizabeth had still believed in fairy tale endings. Some from the 60s and 70s, when she'd been raising their children and managing the early challenges of her reign. Some recent, within the last few years. 4 decades of evidence that Philip had never been faithful, had possibly never even tried. Elizabeth had sat on the floor of Philip's study, surrounded by photographs of her husband with other women, and felt something inside her die. Not dramatically, not with rage or tears or breakdown, just a quiet internal death, a piece of her that had still hoped for love finally accepting that hope was delusion. She was 73 years old. She'd been queen for 37 years. She'd devoted her life to duty and service and institutional preservation. And her reward was sitting on the floor of her husband's study, looking at proof that he'd spent their entire marriage treating her as an obligation while pursuing actual desire elsewhere. Was this what duty cost? Was this the price of being queen? And if so, was it worth it? The question felt dangerous, subversive, the kind of thing queens weren't supposed to ask. But Elizabeth asked it anyway, there on the floor surrounded by evidence of betrayal. If she could go back to 1947, knowing everything she knew now, would she still marry Philip? Would she still choose this life? Or would she run as far and fast as possible from the crown and the duty and the man who would spend 40+ years making her feel inadequate and undesired while she performed perfect devotion? She'd carefully returned everything to the drawer, relocked it, erased all evidence of her search. Because that's what she did. Maintained appearances, preserved secrets, protected Philip's reputation even when he'd done nothing to earn that protection. She went back to her own rooms and sat staring at nothing until Philip returned from shooting, cheerful and energized, kissed her cheek, and asked what she'd done with her day. Nothing much, Elizabeth had said, just reading. The lie was automatic, the performance seamless, and she hated herself for it. Hated that 4 decades of training had made dishonesty her default response. Hated that protecting Philip, protecting the marriage, protecting the institution, took precedence over her own dignity and truth. Hated that she'd become so thoroughly colonized by duty that she couldn't even access authentic anger or demand basic respect from her own husband. She was a queen who commanded millions but couldn't command her husband's fidelity or honesty. A woman with enormous power who was completely powerless in her own marriage. The contradiction was crushing, the humiliation infinite, and the loneliness, the bone-deep, soul-crushing loneliness of carrying this knowledge alone, unable to confide in anyone, because doing so would create scandal, was slowly destroying what little remained of Elizabeth the person beneath Elizabeth the queen. Who was she without the performance, without the duty, without the crown? Did that person even exist anymore? Or had 40+ years of sublimating self to roll finally completed the transformation, leaving only a very sophisticated automaton going through motions of humanity while feeling nothing authentic at all? She didn't know, couldn't know, could only continue performing while dying internally, one small piece at a time, until eventually there'd be nothing left but the performance. Empty, automatic, perfect. Derek Hokie Thriklu 6% peen. The confrontation Elizabeth had avoided finally came 6 weeks later, but not in the way she'd expected. She and Philip were in London, getting dressed for a state dinner, and Philip was struggling with his cufflinks. "Darling, could you help?" He'd asked it casually, holding out his wrists, and Elizabeth had moved to help automatically, 42 years of wifely service making the gesture reflexive. But as she fastened the cufflinks, expensive platinum ones she'd given him for an anniversary years ago, she'd seen something on his wrist. A faint mark, reddish, crescent-shaped. A scratch or bite mark, unmistakable in its origin, from nails or teeth, from passion, from recent sex. The evidence was right there on his skin, presented to her for fastening cufflinks, the intimacy of the gesture making the betrayal more obscene. Elizabeth's hands had frozen. Philip noticed, looked down at his wrist, saw what she was seeing. For one long moment they just stared at each other, the truth visible between them, undeniable, and Elizabeth had waited. For apology, for explanation for something. But Philip had just gently pulled his wrist back, finished fastening the cufflinks himself, and said, "We should go. Don't want to be late." As if she hadn't seen. As if the mark didn't exist. As if their entire marriage wasn't a lie they were both actively maintaining. Elizabeth had felt something break inside her. The last fragile hope that maybe Philip had some shame, some regret, some recognition that his behavior hurt her. But he had none of those things. He had only casual entitlement to do whatever he wanted, confident that Elizabeth would never actually challenge him, because doing so would require acknowledging truths that damaged the institution. He'd assessed the power dynamics correctly, had understood that her devotion to duty made her complicit in her own humiliation, and he'd weaponized that understanding, conducting affairs with increasingly little discretion because he knew absolutely, that she would absorb it all silently, would protect him, would protect the marriage, would sacrifice her own dignity to maintain appearances. He'd been right. God help her, he'd been right. Because Elizabeth had gone to that state dinner, had smiled and made conversation and performed perfect queen, while the man beside her still wore evidence of recent infidelity on his wrist, had let photographers capture images of their happy marriage that would appear in newspapers worldwide, had participated fully in the lie, had chosen institutional preservation over personal truth. Again, still, always, what did that make her? Dutiful, or just pathetic? Strong, or just broken? The years that followed were a slow erosion of whatever remained of Elizabeth's sense of self. Philip continued his affairs, some discreet, some less so, and Elizabeth continued pretending not to notice. The performance became more practiced, more automatic, more divorced from any authentic feeling. They appeared together at events, smiled for cameras, performed devoted partnership while barely speaking in private. Their conversations became purely functional. Schedules, children, official business, void of any personal connection or intimacy. They slept in separate rooms, had for years, which made Philip's liaisons logistically easier and Elizabeth's pretense of ignorance more sustainable. They were married in name and appearance only, roommates performing a role for public consumption while living essentially separate lives. And Elizabeth told herself this was fine, this was manageable. This was what royal marriages looked like when you stripped away the mythology. Duty and appearances and institutional preservation. Love was for ordinary people who had the luxury of choosing partners based on genuine affection rather than dynastic necessity. She'd been naive to expect more, foolish to hope for fidelity. The crown demanded sacrifice, and this was simply one more thing she'd sacrificed: the fairy tale, the romance, the belief that her husband actually wanted her. She'd given it all to the institution, and the institution had given her nothing back except more demands for sacrifice. Was it worth it? She still didn't know. Couldn't know. Could only continue carrying the weight while pretending it wasn't crushing her, while maintaining perfect composure, while performing happiness and partnership and everything the public needed to believe, even when it was all complete fiction. This was her life. This was her choice. This was what being queen actually meant when you stripped away the pageantry and got to the brutal truth. You gave everything. You got nothing. You smiled anyway. And you never, ever told the truth about what it cost. Her 40-80%. The ending came not with confrontation but with acceptance. Elizabeth was 87 years old, Philip 86, and he was dying, slowly but definitely, his body finally failing after 9 decades of use. She visited him in the hospital, sat beside his bed, held his hand because that's what devoted wives did even when devotion was performance. And Philip, drifting in and out of consciousness, had looked at her with sudden clarity and said, "I'm sorry." Just that 2 words, quiet, almost inaudible, "I'm sorry." And Elizabeth had frozen, uncertain whether he was apologizing for dying, or for their marriage, or for 40+ years of infidelity and humiliation, or for all of it combined. She'd opened her mouth to ask what he was apologizing for, but he'd already drifted back into unconsciousness, the moment passing, the clarity gone. And Elizabeth had sat there holding his hand, wondering if those 2 words were enough, wondering if they changed anything, wondering if apology at the end erased the accumulated weight of decades of betrayal, or if it was just one more inadequate gesture from a man who'd spent their entire marriage giving her inadequate pieces of himself, while reserving his full self for others. She'd never know. Philip died 3 days later, and Elizabeth became a widow who the world mourned with, praising their 73-year love story, their devoted partnership, their model marriage. And Elizabeth had stood at his funeral, accepted condolences about losing her beloved husband, and performed grief for a man she wasn't sure she'd ever actually known. performed love for a relationship that had been transactional and hollow and sustained only by her willingness to accept betrayal after betrayal in service of institutional preservation. The world saw a grieving widow. Elizabeth felt nothing. Relief, maybe, that the performance was finally over, that she didn't have to pretend anymore, didn't have to maintain the fiction, didn't have to absorb humiliation in silence, but also emptiness, because 73 years of marriage, even a deeply flawed marriage, leaves a hole when it ends. Even bad partnerships create habits, rhythms, familiar patterns that their absence disrupts. She was unmoored. Free but also lost. A widow who'd spent 7 decades performing devotion to a man who'd never really been hers. What do you do with that? How do you grieve someone you loved and resented in equal measure? How do you process 73 years of complexity that can never be simplified into the narrative the public demanded? Faithful husband, devoted wife, love story for the ages. It was all lies, all performance. And Elizabeth had been both victim and accomplice, hurt by Philip's betrayals, but also complicit in maintaining the fiction that denied those betrayals existed. They'd collaborated on a lie, performed it perfectly. And now Philip was dead, and Elizabeth was alone with the truth, and the truth was, she'd wasted her life on a man who'd never loved her back, had sacrificed dignity and authenticity and any hope of genuine intimacy for a marriage that existed only for appearances, had chosen duty over self so completely that self had essentially ceased to exist, leaving only the role, the performance, the queen who smiled and waved and maintained perfect composure while hollow inside. Was that what her life had been? 73 years of marriage to a man she'd seen in bed with another woman but never confronted. Decades of performing love while receiving only obligation in return. A lifetime of choosing institutional preservation over personal dignity. If so, what had it all been for? The monarchy would continue after she died, would function just fine without her, would find another person to wear the crown and make the sacrifices and perform the role. Her individual suffering meant nothing to the institution. She was replaceable, expendable, useful only insofar as she maintained appearances and fulfilled duties and never, ever demanded that her own needs or feelings or dignity matter. She'd learned that lesson well, had internalized it so thoroughly that even now, widowed and free and no longer required to protect Philip's reputation, she still couldn't bring herself to tell the truth, still maintained the fiction, still participated in her own erasure, because that's what queens did. They sacrificed everything, even truth, even self, even the possibility of being remembered accurately. They gave it all to duty, and duty gave them nothing back except more demands for sacrifice. Until eventually, there was nothing left to give, just a shell, a performance, a role sustained by habit long after the person playing it had disappeared entirely. That was Elizabeth's legacy, not the 70-year reign or the dignified service or the model of duty the public celebrated, but the private truth she'd never speak. She'd been hollow for decades, dead inside while appearing perfectly alive, a ghost performing humanity, the crown's most perfect product and most complete victim, and no one would ever know. Because even in death, even when free of all obligations, she would protect the institution, would maintain the lie, would sacrifice truth one final time, because that's what she'd been trained to do. That's what 70 years of service had programmed into her. That's what being queen actually meant. You died without ever having lived. You performed until the end. You gave everything and got nothing, and you never, ever told anyone what it cost. That was duty. That was sacrifice. That was the price of the crown, and Elizabeth had paid it, in full, until nothing remained but the performance, perfect, hollow, dead.